All right, let's get started. Welcome to the Introduction 300 level webinar on JSON and XML data sources, as well as XPath. This goes over the basics of what these files are, when you would need to use them, and how to use them in Klipfolio. After watching this webinar, you will be able to manipulate basic JSON or XML data in Klipfolio using simple XPath functions or standardized selection options. This is a prequel to the advanced 400 level XPath webinar, which goes over some more complex ways to get the data you want in Klipfolio. There will be a 10-minute freestyle question period at the end, but if at any point in the webinar you feel like you need clarification on something that I have said or done, feel free to let me know. So firstly, let's talk about what JSON and XML data sources actually are. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, while XML is Extensible Markup Language. These are different than the cell-based data sources you're likely to have worked with, like Excel or CSV, because they actually contain nested arrays and objects instead of rows and columns. For a lot of Klipfolio newcomers, you've probably never seen either one of these data sources before. Let's see what this looks like in a live example. So we're going to go into our first clip here. So we're going to edit that clip. And we're going to take a look at an example that you've probably seen or something very similar to what you've seen before in the past. So our data source here is a typical CSV file. It has rows and columns, and there's a 1-to-1 ratio of values in column A to column B to column C, D, and etc. Now, let's take a look at our file sample JSON, which contains some information about a restaurant. This is a JSON file, and as you can see, this data is not in cellular format at all, but it's just arrays and objects that contain other arrays and objects. If I click on one of the nodes here, you'll see that they expand out, and I can continue to go into deeper levels as long as there is more data. The advantage to a data source like this is that you can effectively represent multiple different kinds of data, even if there is no logical way to line that up in rows and columns. For instance, if we take a look at the information in our data source, we have 3 distinct sets of information, which would all require their own sheets in Excel file. We have the general information about the restaurant, which is the name and the tables. Then we have some information about the staff, which includes the full-time and part-time count of each, as well as the name and employment status of all the employees. And finally, we have a list of information for the reservations, which has its own subsection for each reservation. Another advantage in using JSON or XML data in Klipfolio is that if you add more information to the file somewhere in the middle, your formulas in Klipfolio will still point to the correct data, because they are based on the name of the information you are pointing to, not just the actual location in the file. If I were to add another column to an Excel or CSV file, every one of my columns would move over, and my formulas in Klipfolio would be pointing to the wrong column. So let's take a look at what that could look like. So if we were to use one of these data sources here, and I were to look at column A, and I wanted this to be my region. Now if I added column A to be something else, or added a sales column or something else that moved over the data in my sheet, all of my formulas in Klipfolio would no longer be looking at the correct thing. Column A would no longer be the region. This is not something we have to worry about in XML or JSON data sources because they are based on the name. So let's talk a little bit about the differences between the 2 different kinds of files. So while JSON and XML data sources are both array-based and not your typical cellular data, they are a little bit different. So firstly, in JSON data sources, we have the ability to use the KF fill elements, KFNames, and KFElementAdd XPath functions. Unfortunately, these don't work quite as well in the XML files, and in fact just give you an error. We can usually get around this, however, with some tricky XPath, but we'll talk about that more in the advanced 400 level webinar. The other difference is that when using the preceding and following sibling keywords in our XPath, for JSON, they are based on the alphabetical order, while in XML, they are based on the order they appear in the file. However, again, that's not something we'll cover in this webinar, and once again, you'll have to check it out in our advanced webinar on JSON on XML XPath this Friday. Another great place to start if you're just getting into these data sources is our knowledge base, which has a great in-depth dissection of many of the topics we will cover today, as well as some more technical XPath functions. So let's just do a quick overview of it now. I happen to have that lined up right here. So in general, this documentation covers how to select JSON or XML data, the basics of moving up or down levels between parents, children, and siblings, and how to use the special Klipfolio KFNames and KFFillElements functions. These are at the bottom of the document and are probably the most looked at part of this, even for advanced XPath experts. Now, it's fairly unusual to have a manually created file be in JSON or XML format. In fact, for many of you, you've probably never done this before. So you may be wondering why this would even apply to you. The answer is that a large chunk of the third-party services that Klipfolio connects to return data in one of these formats, especially JSON. For example, see two of our most common services that customers use, which are Salesforce and Facebook. If I take a look at the Salesforce data source here, you can see how they structure their data. As you can see, this is not a CSV or Excel file, but is in fact JSON, and we need to use XPath to get what we're looking at. If we take a look at our Facebook data source, it's a pretty similar story. We have values inside of values, arrays inside of arrays, and again, not a typical CSV or Excel file. Now that we know what these data sources are and why we would need them, let's talk about how to use them. To change which data we're looking at in the data source, we use something called XPath. This is basically a pointer to what exactly in the data source we want to use in our formulas. To see what this would look like, all you need to do is click on one of the nodes in your formula. So let's go to our sample JSON data source again. Let's go to our reservations and the tables. As it populates the column, see how in the formula bar, the part in blue describes where in my data source I'm looking at. In this case, I'm looking through all tables values in each of the reservations objects. What this gives me is the amount of tables required for each reservation that's been made. To change what I want to point to in the data source, simply click on the blue part in the formula bar, then wherever you wish inside the data at the bottom. So as you can see, our column has changed, and this has also changed the XPath in the blue part of our formula as well. XPath is extremely powerful and can be modified to get very specific information from your data in a much more dynamic way than in cellular-based data. There are some times, however, when what you can get by clicking on the data source is not specific enough. For example, if I were to look at the reservation section, I can see that there are 5 reservations. If I click on the time node, what this gives me is the time value for all of the reservations, which might be what I want. However, maybe what I want instead is the time for this particular reservation only, and not all of them. There's no way to differentiate between these just by clicking, so we need to take a bit of a different route by modifying the XPath. The first option we have for modifying the XPath is by using our selection options. These are pre-built XPaths built into Klipfolio to look at different kinds of information and can be much more specific than the kind of information you get by just clicking. You will find your selection options inside the data itself in the bottom panel. If you can't see them, like when you're outside of that particular node, you can find them by clicking on the blue XPath in the formula bar. This will make it appear in the bottom panel again. Let's just do a quick example of that. So if I click outside my XPath, I can get to my selection options again just by clicking on the blue part in my formula, and notice it pops up again in the bottom panel here. Now that I have it open, let's actually take a look at what it can do for us. For the time element, my selection options are to get only that specific time, all times for all reservations, and times in the entire data source, or all times in that one reservation. The selection options might be different depending on what I've clicked on, as different combinations of nested objects and arrays have different possibilities. You can also see a little preview underneath of what the data would look like if you were to choose this option. Let's just click on the option we want to use, which in this case is the first one. As we can see in our preview, it's showing only the value we want, and then we hit Set Selection. Now, if we look in our table, we see that instead of having all the times being shown, we are now displaying only the time that we selected. Let's try another example with our selection methods, using the name element instead. So we're going to do reservation/name. However, if you take a look at the very top of the element, you'll notice that there is another name which corresponds with the name of the restaurant. This has the same and complete spelling as the name inside of the reservations, however. Let's say that for some reason you also wanted to get this name, and not just the ones in reservations. Right now, this would be excluded, but you can display it as well using your selection options. You can use the selection options to get all names instead of just the ones you clicked on. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. We're going to select the third option here. And we can see in our preview that it's showing all the names, including the first one, which applies to the name of the restaurant. We set that to our selection. We say our table column modifies. Selection options are a great option for beginners. However, there are some occasions when you can't use them. This is either because what you need is too specific, such as getting data with conditions. An example would be if I wanted to get all the names for reservations of more than one table. Another possibility is that sometimes, due to the structure of the data, the selection options might not work at all. This happens with nested arrays inside of arrays and other data sources with unusual data structure that are not capable of being dealt with using the default options. In these cases, what you will need to do is actually write the XPath yourself. XPath is actually its own language, separate from Klipfolio, so if you are ever looking for something specific, there are some great resources online to help teach you. But we'll go over some of the more common notations in this webinar. In addition, the Advanced 400 series webinar covers more advanced XPath notation in detail. To edit the XPath manually, in your formula bar, double-click on the blue node and start typing. To change the data source that you're using for your XPath, you can do the following. We're going to use this name XPath as our example because it can also work from multiple data sources that we have in this clip. First, double-click on the XPath in the formula bar. Then, press the left arrow key and then backspace to delete the @ symbol. Then, re-enter the @ symbol and choose the data source you want from the drop-down list. Let's use the Facebook data source as an example, since it also has a name element in it. Finally, just delete the extra characters before the XPath. And voila. Now we can see our XPath has been converted to be used for the Facebook data source. Let's get into the specifics of some of the most common things we need to do using XPath. As a general rule, whenever we want to add a condition to our XPath or point at something more specific, we will use square braces. For this example, I'm going to head back to the restaurant sample JSON data source. We're going to change this to the reservation/people, which gives me the number of people per reservation. Now, let's add an index to this XPath. This is something that we might not be able to get using our selection options. I'm going to grab the number of people for the second reservation in the list. To do this, we just need to add the square braces and add the number 2 beside the reservations inside of our XPath. So again, we're going to double-click our square braces, and then inside of the square braces, just the index, or the number of the reservation that you want to be looking at, which in this case is 2. As we can see, 3 people for the second reservation, which lines up with what we're seeing in our data. we can always add indices at multiple levels as well. For example, if it were possible to have more than one people value for reservation, we could do reservations at 2 and people at 1 to make sure the first people value of the second reservation is what we're getting. If it was possible to have more than one people value per reservation and we wanted to get the second one of the second reservation, we would do people at 2, reservations at 2. Or I'm sorry, reservations at 2, people 2. Now we're going to go the complete opposite route and talk about the wildcard, or star character. In XPath, what this does is get the value of everything, not just one specific node. We're going to combine this in our next example to get all the information about the second reservation. We're actually going to remove the people element from our XPath and instead replace it with the wildcard character. For this example as well, we're also going to, oh, no, I'm sorry. Instead of giving us just the number of people for the reservation, this gives us all the information, including the name, number of tables, and time. As we can see in our table, we have the name Joe, number of tables is 3, and the people is 1. Something that's a unique problem to JSON and XML data sources is that sometimes your data can get out of alignment. This happens when there are some values missing for certain elements. For example, let's make a table with the name and number of people for each reservation. So it's obvious right away that something is wrong with our table. For the person Tyrion, the 5th reservation, he's showing a reservation with 2 people. But if we look at our data source, we can see he only has a reservation for 1 person. Also, the reservation of 2 people does not have a name attached to it. Since there are only 3 reservations with names, but 5 total, we have a misalignment of data. We can check this by evaluating these individual nodes in Klipfolio by clicking on them and then pressing the lightning bolt button, or using the handy shortcut Alt-A. So if we evaluate people, we see that we get 5. If we evaluate name, we see that we only get 3. This is because anytime you have missing nodes in a JSON or XML object, it simply skips that instead of returning a blank or null value where it would have been. This commonly causes objects with missing nodes to be out of alignment. However, for JSON sources, we can get around this by using the special KFFillElements function. For data sources that are missing nodes, it will return a blank value in place of these missing values. Let's see an example now in the first column. For XPath functions, we start typing to the right of the @ symbol, and the first parameter of the KFFillElements function is the entirety of the XPath, excluding the final node or nodes that might be missing, inside of quotation marks and excluding the slashes, and you can see that here. So if we take a look at our column, we can see that we now have blank values for the missing entries, and the values are aligned properly. You can learn more about the KFFillElements function in our XPath documentation we discussed earlier. We're going to jump on over to the employees of the data source, which has a bit of an unusual data structure. So we can see that if we open it up all the way, the names, which is the value on the left-hand side, are the names of the employees. And the values, which is the value on the right-hand side, are their employment status. Let's say that we don't really care about the employment status, but we actually want the names of the employees instead. We can't get this information just by clicking on the data source, nor can we get it from the selection options. So what we'll need to do is use the KFNames function. What this does is give you the names, not the values, of every object inside the XPath that you pass to it. So the XPath here would be everything up to, but not including, any of the employee names, which would be just the staff and employee nodes, and not anything else inside that. We're going to do an example here for this node. So again, we start typing directly to the right of the @ symbol. We type in the KFNames. We're going to start off with /staff, which gets me down to the first level of staff. We're going to do another slash to get down to the level of the employees. And then we're going to stop there. As you can see, this gives us the list of all the employee names in alphabetical order. You can again learn more about this in our XPath documentation. Now, for the next example, we assumed we only wanted the names. Well, what if we actually wanted instead was the employment status, which is the value, not the name? If we just try clicking on it, we're going to have some problems. This is one of those special situations I mentioned earlier, where an unusual data structure can cause the default options in Klipfolio some problems. In this case, what the issue is that there is a space character inside of the name, which is again on the left-hand side here, which is breaking our XPath. Another common scenario is when you have other special characters inside of name, such as the @ symbol. To get around this, we'll need to use the name function, which is not to be confused with the KFNames function. The name function can only give you one name at a time, while KFNames can give you many at once. However, you can use the name function as a condition inside of your XPath, which is what we're going to do here. This should also not be confused with the name node inside of our data, or the name which refers to the left-hand side of our objects in JSON. So neither of those have brackets beside them. If we want to get the employment status of Josh Cohen Collier, I need to insert a condition using the square brackets in the name function. I'm also going to combine this with the wildcard we mentioned earlier. So if we see here, what I did is I inserted the wildcard character, which is going to get me everything under staff/employees, so the values of anything underneath here. However, because we need to specify a specific name, we need to use the name function. The name function is the word name followed by the two brackets, and again, not to be confused with the name parameter or the name on the left-hand side of the JSON object. And then we enter inside of quotation marks the exact name that we're looking for. So as you can see, it's giving me the status, or the employment status of Josh Cohen Collier, which is full-time. For another example, we're going to be using the name function again. This time, we'll be looking at the full-time and part-time counts. What we're going to be doing is finding the name of the entry that has a value of 6, which in this case is full-time. So we're going to be finding everything under the staff, where the condition is that the value is 6. To show a value in a condition at the same level, you can do this in XPath with a period. So what we're going to be doing here is /staff/star. We're going to be adding the condition where the value is equal to 6. Now, this obviously gives us 6 because we're finding the value where the value is equal to 6. However, all we need to do at this point is wrap this in the name function, which again goes to the left of the @ symbol, wrap our XPath in brackets, and voila, we have the employment status that has 6 members. To look for more specific conditions in XPath, you can use operators inside your brackets. XPath operators are things that compare different values and give a value of true or false, similar to Boolean logic. If you've never used them before, don't fret because they're fairly simple and easy to get a hang of. The operators we're going to cover today deal only with testing for quality and the larger than or smaller than status of numbers. The first number we're going to be looking at, or the first operator, is the greater than operator. So for our example, let's say we wanted to get the information of reservations where there are more than 2 people coming. To do a greater than operator, you use the right tag brace. So what we're going to be doing here is getting all the information about the reservations where the number of people in that reservation is more than 2. So we're going to start off with reservations. We're going to be getting all the information, so we want to get the star character here at the end. We want to add a condition to the reservations. The condition is that the number of people, which is underneath it, is greater than 2. Oops, sorry, I forgot a slash here. Now we always need to add a slash before our next level, which means that the slash character in XPath brings us down a level. So if I do reservation slash, it's going everything underneath reservations. We can see that we're getting the name, number of tables and people, and time for both of the reservations that have more than 2 people. Oh, I'm sorry, 3 people or more. We can do the similar less than condition to check for tables that are less than 2 using the opening brace tag. So this is finding everything underneath the reservations, which is any of these values here, where the people is less than 2. We can also do less than or equal to by having an equal sign after the open tag. So this would give us any of the reservations with 1 or 2 people. In similar fashion, we can also do a greater than or equal to by putting the equal sign after the closing tag. Finally, we already showed an example of an equals operator before. However, in this case, what we're going to do is get everything that is not equal to 2. You can do the not equal sign in XPath notation by putting an exclamation mark in front of the equal sign. So again, this will get all the information about any of the reservations where the number of people is not 2. Alright, well that's all we have time to cover today, but thanks for tuning in, and I hope you learned a lot. Tune in this Friday for our next session, which will cover some more advanced XPath, as well as how to do KF fill elements on XML, and using Klipfolio functions or variables inside of our XPath. If anyone has any questions, feel free to let me know, and we have a little bit of time to go over them.